I was standing barefoot on the back porch when my mother told me to leave, the cold wood seeping straight into my skin like it was trying to memorize me. Snow hadn't started falling yet, but the air had that sharp metallic bite that always comes right before winter decides to make a point. Inside the house, the smell of roasted turkey and burned sugar from an overcooked pie hung heavy, mixed with the sound of a family that had already decided I no longer belonged to it. My father's voice was calm when he said it, which somehow hurt more than if he'd shouted. He said I was almost 30 and still had nothing to show for it. My mother nodded, arms crossed, eyes flat, and added the word that would echo in my head for years to come. Burden. That was what they called me. Not struggling, not lost, just a burden. A weight they were finally setting down. When the door closed behind me, it didn't slam. It clicked. Soft, final, deliberate, like a verdict. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the hum of their warm kitchen, the clink of silverware, my sister's laugh drifting through the window as if nothing had happened. My phone buzzed once in my hand, then went quiet again. Battery already low, like it knew better than to give me false hope. I was wearing a thin sweater, no coat, no shoes, my toes numb and red against the porch boards. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be unwanted. Not in theory, not in fear, but in fact. And then, as I turned to leave, my fingers brushed against something stiff inside my bag. Paper, an envelope, thick, yellowed at the edges, the one my grandfather told me to open only when I truly needed it. I didn't open it that night. I couldn't, not yet. Because if there was nothing inside, I wasn't sure I'd survive knowing that too. I drove away from the house I grew up in with the heater blasting uselessly, blowing cold air that smelled faintly of dust. The street was lined with holiday lights, every window glowing with warmth, families gathered around tables, laughter spilling into the night. I kept my eyes on the road because if I looked at any of it too long, I might pull over and cry, in a way I'd never recover from. My name is Claire Whitmore. I was 29 years old that winter. I had a degree my parents never thought was practical enough, a job they considered temporary even though I'd held it for years, and no spouse, no children, no house of my own. In their eyes, that made me unfinished. In their words, it made me a failure. The argument that night had started the way all our arguments did, quietly and politely, with criticism disguised as concern. My mother asked if I'd thought any more about moving back home permanently. My father asked if I'd considered applying to a real company instead of the nonprofit I worked for. My sister rolled her eyes when I said I was happy. That was the moment everything shifted. Happiness was the one thing I wasn't allowed to claim without permission. Then my father brought up money. He always did. He said the family business was under pressure, that the economy wasn't forgiving, that sacrifices had to be made. He suggested, casually, that I could take out a loan in my name to help them through a rough patch, just temporarily, just until things stabilized. When I hesitated, when I said I needed time to think, the temperature in the room dropped. My mother accused me of being selfish. My father said I'd been taking from the family for years and never giving anything back. He listed everything they'd ever paid for as if love came with receipts. I told them I couldn't do it, not without understanding what I was signing. That was when he stood up and told me to get out. I slept in my car that night, parked behind a closed grocery store, wrapped in a scarf I'd found in the trunk. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice saying I was a burden, my father's saying I'd never make it on my own. Around 4 a.m, when the cold became unbearable, I reached into my bag again and felt the envelope. I remembered the day my grandfather gave it to me. I was maybe 12, sitting at his kitchen table swinging my legs because they didn't quite reach the floor. He slid the envelope toward me without ceremony, his hands steady, his eyes serious, in a way that made me straighten instinctively. He told me not to open it unless I had no other choice. Not when I was curious, not when I was scared, only when I truly needed it. I asked him what was inside. He smiled, soft and sad, and said, "Freedom, if you're brave enough to use it." My parents never liked him. They said he was secretive, stubborn, bad with money. They said he'd wasted his potential and lived too small. After he passed, they barely mentioned him at all, except to complain that he hadn't left much behind. By morning, I was numb in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. I drove to a diner on the edge of town and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a cup of coffee I held between my hands like it was the last warm thing on earth. The envelope sat in my bag, heavy and insistent. I opened it there, in a cracked vinyl booth under flickering fluorescent lights, with strangers eating pancakes around me and no idea my life was about to tilt on its axis. Inside wasn't a letter. Not at first. It was a folder. Inside that, documents, certificates, statements. Names I recognized immediately, companies everyone recognized, the kind of names you heard on the news when markets shifted or deals were announced. Blue-chip stocks, shares held long-term, some in companies that had doubled, tripled, grown quietly over decades, and then, near the back, a familiar name, Whitmore Industrial Group, my family's company. My hands started shaking so badly I had to put the papers down. I stared at the numbers, my brain refusing to process them, my heart pounding in my ears. These weren't symbolic holdings. They weren't sentimental. They were substantial, controlling, enough to matter. At the bottom of the folder was a note, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. "Claire, if you are reading this, it means you finally needed it. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from everything, but I could prepare. These shares are yours, not to punish, not to prove anything, but so no one could ever decide your worth for you again." I sat there until the waitress came by to refill my coffee and asked if I was all right. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. By noon, my phone had come back to life long enough for me to see a string of missed calls from my mother. No messages, no apologies. Just control, reaching for me out of habit. I didn't call back. Instead, I made an appointment with a financial advisor whose name I found through a quiet search, someone who specialized in legacy assets and long-term holdings. His office was nothing like the glass towers my parents loved. It was modest, professional, calm. When I laid the folder on his desk, he went silent in a way that wasn't judgmental, just respectful. "These are real," he said after a long moment. "And they're significant." I asked him one question, the only one that mattered. I asked him if anyone else could touch them. "No," he said, "unless you say so." That was when I realized something my parents never expected. When they threw me out, they thought they were cutting me loose. They thought I'd come back begging. They thought I was powerless. They had no idea they'd just handed me silence. And silence, I was about to learn, was a kind of power they couldn't fight. I left his office that afternoon and walked through the city with my coat zipped up to my chin, the folder tucked under my arm. I wasn't angry, not yet. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't celebrating, I was steady. For the first time in my life, I didn't need them to believe in me. I didn't need to prove anything, I just needed to wait. Because somewhere across town my family was already panicking, already realizing the money wasn't moving the way it was supposed to, already feeling pressure from banks and partners who wanted answers. And they had no idea that the person holding those answers was the same one they'd called a burden and sent out into the cold. That night, as I lay on a borrowed couch in a friend's apartment, the envelope resting on the floor beside me, I understood something with absolute clarity. They thought they ended my story. They were wrong. They'd only just turned the page. I didn't tell anyone where I was going the next morning. I woke up on my friend's couch before the sun came up, the apartment still and dim, the city outside quiet in that rare way it only is before people start demanding things from each other. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then the weight came back. The argument, the word burden, the envelope on the floor beside my bag, exactly where I'd left it. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake my friend, and picked up the folder again. The paper was thicker than normal stock certificates, the kind of thickness that made it feel permanent, real, not something that vanished when you blinked or hoped too hard. I flipped through it once more, slower this time, forcing myself to actually read instead of panic. These weren't recent gifts. These shares had been accumulating for decades. Dividend reinvestments, long-term holds, quiet growth. My grandfather hadn't been careless or lucky. He'd been deliberate, patient, strategic in a way my parents never were. My parents loved loud success, titles, cars, appearances. My grandfather loved time. By 8 o'clock, I was walking into the office of the advisor I'd met the day before. His name was Daniel Moore, mid-50s, calm voice, the kind of man who didn't rush even when things were urgent. His office smelled faintly of coffee and old books. When I sat across from him, he didn't ask how I was feeling. He asked what I wanted to understand. "I need to know what this actually means," I said, sliding the folder across his desk. "Not emotionally, legally." He nodded once and turned the pages, already familiar with most of them from our first meeting. He pulled up a screen beside him, typing quietly, his fingers steady. I watched him work and realized how different this felt from talking to my parents. There was no judgment in his posture, no impatience, just focus. "These shares give you voting rights," he said finally, "not just financial value, influence, in several cases, significant influence." He pointed to one line in particular, Whitmore Industrial Group. "This one," he said, tapping the screen gently, "is going to matter very soon." I felt my stomach tighten. "Because it's my family's company." "Because it's under pressure," he corrected. "Banks don't like uncertainty, and right now there's a lot of it." I hadn't checked the news since the night I was thrown out. I'd been too busy surviving. Daniel turned the screen slightly so I could see. Headlines about supply delays, cash flow tightening, talks of restructuring. Nothing catastrophic yet, but close enough to smell the smoke. "They never told me any of this," I said quietly. "They wouldn't," he replied. "Not if they didn't think you mattered." The words landed harder than he probably intended, but they rang true. My parents had never included me in conversations about the business. They said it wasn't my place, that I wouldn't understand, that it would only stress me out. All those years, they weren't protecting me. They were protecting themselves. "What happens now?" I asked. "That depends on you," Daniel said. "You can stay silent. You can intervene. You can sell. You can hold. But whatever you do, it needs to be intentional." Intentional? My grandfather's word. On my way out, my phone buzzed. My mother's name flashed across the screen. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. A moment later, a text came through. "We need to talk. No apology, no concern, just a demand." I put the phone back in my pocket and walked outside into the cold. The city was awake now. People rushing to work, cars honking, life continuing as if my world hadn't cracked open overnight. I found a bench and sat down, letting the noise wash over me while I thought. I didn't want revenge, not the loud kind. I didn't want to humiliate them or scream truths across a boardroom table. What I wanted was space, distance, control over my own breath. So I decided to wait. Over the next few days, I stayed quiet. I didn't return calls. I didn't respond to messages. I watched instead. Daniel sent me updates, short and factual. Banks requesting meetings, partners hesitating, internal discussions escalating. My parents were scrambling, and they had no idea why things weren't moving the way they usually did. On the fourth day, my sister called. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice sharp, annoyed more than worried. "I'm fine," I said. "That's not the question. Mom's freaking out. Dad's under a lot of stress. You can't just disappear." I almost laughed. Almost. I didn't disappear. I was told to leave. She went quiet for a moment, then sighed. "You know how they get. They didn't mean it like that. They always meant it like that." "I can't help right now," I said, and ended the call before she could argue. That afternoon, Daniel called me instead. "They're looking for the shareholder," he said. My chest tightened. They know someone has the shares. They know someone has been holding them quietly for years, he corrected. They don't know who, but they're trying to find out. I closed my eyes. How long do I have? Before they put the pieces together? He paused. Hard to say, but not forever. That night, I dreamed of my grandfather. He was sitting at his old kitchen table, the one with the chipped edge and the chair that wobbled if you leaned back too far. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me the way he always had, like he trusted me to figure things out on my own. When I woke up, I felt strangely calm. The first official notice came 2 days later. A formal request sent to all major shareholders, calling for an emergency meeting to discuss restructuring options. Daniel forwarded it to me with a simple note. This is the moment. I read the email 3 times, my heart beating faster each time. They were asking for approval, consent, agreement, things my parents had never once asked me for in my entire life. I didn't reply. Instead, I asked Daniel to set up a secure connection for me. Not to speak, not to appear, just to observe. The day of the meeting, I sat in a quiet room with my laptop open, the screen filled with faces I recognized from family dinners and holiday gatherings. Executives, board members. My father at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his voice controlled but strained. My mother sat beside him, composed on the surface, eyes darting whenever someone mentioned timelines or liquidity. They looked smaller than I remembered. The meeting dragged on. Discussions circled, proposals were made and softened. Everyone kept glancing at one empty space on the screen labeled Major Shareholder. That party hasn't responded yet, one of the bankers said finally, frustration creeping into his voice. Without their approval, we can't proceed. My father cleared his throat. We're working on it. I watched him lie with the same confidence he used to lecture me about honesty. The screen flashed. A prompt appeared on my laptop, waiting for my response. Approve, decline, request delay. My finger hovered over the trackpad. This was it, the first test. The first time my silence could change the room. I chose delay. A simple message went through. Neutral language, no emotion, no explanation beyond the need for further review. The reaction was immediate. Confusion. Murmurs. My father's head snapped up, eyes narrowing as if he could see through the screen and find me. My mother leaned in, whispering something urgent in his ear. The meeting ended abruptly. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, heart racing. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't smiling. I felt grounded, like my feet were finally on solid ground after years of balancing on someone else's expectations. That evening, my phone exploded. Calls, texts, voicemails, numbers I didn't recognize, messages from extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone suddenly remembered I existed. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I went for a walk. The air was cold, but it felt clean in my lungs. I passed families heading into restaurants, couples holding hands, strangers living lives that had nothing to do with mine. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was watching from the outside. I felt like I was choosing my own direction. Back at the apartment, I pulled out the note my grandfather had written and read it again, not to punish, not to prove anything. I understood now. This wasn't about taking something from my parents. It was about refusing to give myself away anymore. Later that night, Daniel sent one last message. They're unsettled, and they're afraid. I stared at the words, then set my phone down and turned off the light. I didn't feel powerful. I felt free. And somewhere across town, in the house that had locked me out, my parents were pacing, arguing, trying to regain control over something they could no longer touch. They still didn't know it was me. But they were about to learn that the person they dismissed, ignored, and finally threw away wasn't as powerless as they'd believed. They had taught me how to survive in silence. Now, silence was teaching them something else entirely. The first time I heard my father's name spoken by someone who wasn't afraid of him, it felt unreal. It happened in Daniel's office, Late afternoon light slanting across the carpet, dust floating lazily in the air like nothing in the world was wrong. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said my father's name the way one might say the weather forecast. Calm, neutral, unimpressed. "He's under pressure," Daniel said, "more than he's letting on." I didn't respond right away. Hearing that sentence should have made me feel triumphant. After all, this was the man who had told me I would never make it on my own. The man who had shut the door behind me and returned to his dinner without a second thought. But what I felt instead was a strange, hollow quiet. "How bad?" I asked finally. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Bad enough that banks are no longer patient. Bad enough that one missed approval can shift the entire balance of power." Balance of power. I rolled the phrase around in my mind. My parents had always acted like power was something you grabbed with both hands and squeezed until it bent to your will. Titles, authority, volume. My grandfather had known better. He had taught me that real power waited. It watched. It didn't rush. Daniel slid a printed report across the desk. I glanced at it without touching it at first. Projections, cash flow charts, a red line dipping lower than anyone would want to admit out loud. "They're not insolvent," Daniel continued. "Not yet, but they're close enough that fear is driving their decisions." Fear. I knew that word well. I'd lived inside it most of my life, taught to confuse it with respect. I picked up the report and skimmed it. My father's name appeared over and over again: CEO, lead negotiator, primary decision-maker. The same role he'd used as armor at home, as justification for everything from his absence to his cruelty. "What happens if I do nothing?" I asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then they'll keep scrambling. They'll look for leverage. They'll try to identify the shareholder holding things up." "And if they do?" I asked. He met my eyes. "Then you need to be ready." Ready. The word echoed as I left his office. Outside, the sky had darkened, clouds heavy and low, threatening snow. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and walked without a destination, my thoughts louder than the city. I thought about the first time my father had told me I wasn't cut out for the business. I was 16, standing in his study, clutching a report I'd stayed up all night working on because I wanted to impress him. He skimmed it, pointed out one small error, and tossed it back onto the desk. "You don't have the instincts for this," he'd said. "You're too emotional." That sentence had followed me everywhere. Into college, into jobs, into every decision where I second-guessed myself before anyone else could. Now here I was, holding more influence over that same business than he ever knew. That night, my mother sent a message. "This silence is childish. Come home and talk like an adult." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned my phone face down. She didn't want a conversation. She wanted compliance. The next morning, Daniel called early. "They've started making inquiries," he said. "Quiet ones." My stomach tightened. "About the shareholder?" "Yes, they've asked the bank if there's any flexibility, any way around the delay." And the answer was no. I let out a slow breath. "What about internally?" "They're blaming each other," Daniel said. "Your father thinks someone on the board is undermining him. Your mother thinks it's an external investor with an agenda." I closed my eyes. The image of them arguing in the kitchen flashed in my mind, their voices sharp, their unity dissolving the moment control slipped from their grasp. I'd seen it before. Whenever things went wrong, they turned on each other, then outward, searching for someone to carry the blame. They had never once looked inward. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went back to my grandfather's old neighborhood. The house had been sold, renovated, painted a neutral gray that stripped it of all the warmth I remembered. I parked across the street and sat in my car, watching strangers move inside the rooms where I'd once felt safe. I didn't go up to the door. I didn't need to. The memories were enough. I remembered my grandfather sitting at the table, spreading out newspapers, circling articles with a pen. He'd taught me how to read between the lines, how to listen for what wasn't being said, how to wait until the moment was right. People reveal themselves under pressure, he used to say. All you have to do is pay attention. That evening, another email arrived. A second request from the bank, more urgent this time. The language was still polite, but the undertone had shifted. Time was no longer abundant. Daniel called me shortly after. "They're pushing harder," he said. "Your delay rattled them." "Good," I replied before I could stop myself. There was a pause on the line. "Claire," he said gently, "this isn't about punishing them." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "It's about clarity." That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from awareness. Every decision I'd ever made suddenly felt heavier, more deliberate. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. The next morning, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Claire," my father said when I answered, his voice controlled but tight. "We need to talk." I almost hung up. Almost. Instead, I stayed silent. "This situation with the company," he continued, rushing to fill the space. "It's serious. Families pull together in moments like this." There it was. Family, the word he used when he wanted something. "I'm busy," I said calmly. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Busy?" he repeated, incredulous. "With what?" "With my life," I said. "The one you told me to leave with." Silence. Thick. Uncomfortable. "This isn't the time for resentment," he said finally. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand more than you think," I replied. He scoffed. "You don't even know how the business works." I looked out the window, watching snow begin to fall, soft and relentless. "You're right," I said. "I don't know how you run it. I know how my grandfather planned." That got his attention. "What does that mean?" he demanded. "It means I'm not talking about this over the phone," I said, "and it means I'm not coming home." I hung up before he could respond. My hands were steady when I set the phone down. That surprised me. Later that day, Daniel and I met again. He laid out the next steps carefully. Options, consequences, lines I couldn't uncross once I stepped over them. "If you stay silent much longer," he said, "they'll either fold or make a mistake." "And if they make a mistake?" I asked. "Then the truth comes out faster than they're ready for." That night, I received a message from my sister. "Dad says you're playing games. Mom's crying. This isn't funny." I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood something. Every time I responded, I reinforced their belief that they could still reach me, that I would still bend. Silence wasn't cruelty. It was a boundary. 2 days later, the announcement came. An emergency shareholders meeting scheduled within the week. Attendance mandatory. Decisions final. Daniel forwarded the notice with a single line. "They're desperate." I stared at the screen, my heart beating faster, not with fear but with anticipation. This was the moment everything began to shift from private tension to public consequence. That evening, as I packed a small bag, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, not in years, but in weight, in presence. The girl who'd been thrown out into the cold with no shoes would have begged for reassurance by now. She would have apologized for existing. I wasn't her anymore. Before bed, I took out my grandfather's note one last time and read it slowly. Not to punish, not to prove anything. I whispered the words into the quiet room, letting them settle into me. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering the city in a clean, white silence. Somewhere across town, my parents were preparing for a meeting they thought would decide their future. They still believed power belonged to the loudest voice in the room. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne, the kind of space designed to intimidate before a single word was spoken. I arrived early on purpose, not to make a statement, but to observe. Power always revealed itself in the moments people thought no one important was watching. The long table sat empty when I entered, leather chairs perfectly aligned, water glasses untouched. At the far end, a wall of glass looked out over the city skyline, gray and sharp under a winter sky. This was my father's favorite room. He liked the way people sat straighter here, spoke softer, deferred faster. I took a seat halfway down the table, not at the head, not at the margins. Neutral ground. As the minutes passed, voices filtered in from the hallway. Laughter that sounded forced, shoes clicking with practiced confidence. The board members arrived in clusters, exchanging pleasantries that barely concealed tension. I watched them carefully. Some avoided looking at me. Others glanced my way, curiosity flickering across their faces before being masked by politeness. Then my parents walked in. My mother entered first, posture rigid, pearls perfectly centered at her throat. She scanned the room automatically, counting allies, assessing expressions. When her eyes landed on me, her steps faltered for half a second, just long enough for me to see it. Shock. My father followed, his presence filling the space the way it always did. He was mid-sentence, already performing authority, until he saw where my mother was staring. His words trailed off. His jaw tightened. "What is she doing here?" he asked sharply, not bothering to lower his voice. Several heads turned. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The chair beside me shifted as Daniel took his seat calmly, setting his folder on the table like this was the most natural arrangement in the world. "Good morning," Daniel said evenly. "Shall we begin?" My father's gaze snapped to him. "This is a closed meeting." Daniel met his stare without blinking. "It is, and she's invited." My father laughed, a short, humorless sound. "By whom?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply slid a document across the table toward the center. The room went quiet. My mother stepped closer, peering down at the paper. I watched her eyes move, watched the color drain from her face inch by inch. "That's not possible," she whispered. My father grabbed the document, scanning it quickly, then again more slowly. His hands trembled, just slightly, but enough. "Who authorized this?" he demanded. Daniel folded his hands. "The shareholder." Silence fell like a weight. My father looked at me then, really looked at me. Not as his daughter, not as a problem, as something else entirely. "You," he said, disbelief cracking his voice. I met his gaze calmly. "Yes." The word seemed to echo. A murmur rippled through the room. Confusion, surprise, interest. Board members leaned closer to the table, suddenly awake. "This is a misunderstanding," my father said quickly, turning to them. "There's been some kind of clerical error." "There hasn't," Daniel replied. "The shares were transferred legally years ago. They've appreciated significantly since then." My mother's lips parted. "Transferred from whom?" Daniel didn't look at her when he answered. "Your father-in-law." The room froze. I could almost hear the moment something shattered inside them. The narrative they'd clung to. The lies they'd repeated so often they'd begun to believe them. "He didn't have anything," my father said hoarsely. "We handled his affairs." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You handled what you were allowed to handle." I spoke then, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. "He planned carefully, quietly." My father slammed his hand on the table. "You have no right to be here." I tilted my head slightly. "I have every right, more than most, actually." The chair across from me scraped loudly as one of the senior board members leaned forward. "Let's slow down," he said. "If what Daniel is saying is accurate, then she holds a significant stake." Daniel nodded. "Enough to block the current financing proposal." Another murmur. Louder this time. My father turned back to me, panic bleeding through his anger. "You don't understand what you're doing. This company employs hundreds of people." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I said quietly. "I'm listening." My mother stepped toward me, lowering her voice. "This is not the place for family drama." I looked up at her. "You made it public the moment you threw me out." Her face flushed. "That has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this," I replied. You just didn't realize it yet. The board chair cleared his throat. Perhaps we should hear from the shareholder directly. All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, feeling the room shift as I did. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. My grandfather believed in long-term thinking, I began. He believed that the people who shout the loudest are often hiding the most. He invested not just in companies, but in safeguards. I paused, letting the words sink in. He left those safeguards to me. My father shook his head. This is manipulation. I met his gaze evenly. No, this is inheritance. Daniel stood beside me now, handing out copies of the relevant documents. Papers passed from hand to hand. Brows furrowed, whispers resumed, sharper, more urgent. One of the board members looked up. Why wasn't this disclosed earlier? Daniel answered. Because it didn't need to be, until now. My mother's voice trembled despite her effort to control it. What do you want? The question hung in the air, raw and exposed. I considered it carefully. This was the moment they'd always prepared me for. The moment of negotiation. The moment where they expected me to ask for something small so they could dismiss me. I want transparency, I said. I want ethical oversight, and I want the financing deal paused until an independent review is completed. My father laughed again, but it sounded brittle. You're going to tank the company out of spite? I shook my head. Out of responsibility. The board chair nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. My father spun toward him. Reasonable? This is sabotage. It's governance, the chair replied, and frankly, overdue. My mother's composure finally cracked. You're doing this because you're angry. I met her eyes, and for the first time, I saw fear there. Real fear. I'm doing this because I'm done being invisible. The meeting stretched on, arguments looping, alliances shifting in real time. I watched my parents lose control inch by inch, not because anyone attacked them, but because the truth refused to bend. By the time the vote was called, the outcome was clear. The financing deal was postponed. My father sat back in his chair, staring at the table like it had betrayed him. My mother gathered her things in silence, her hands shaking. As people began to leave, the room buzzed with subdued conversation. Daniel leaned toward me. You did well, he murmured. I nodded, my pulse still racing. It's not over. No, he agreed. But it started. My parents approached me near the door. This isn't finished, my father said quietly. I met his gaze without flinching. I know. My mother searched my face, something like regret flickering briefly before being buried under pride. You've made your choice. Yes, I said simply. I have. They walked out together, shoulders stiff, whispers urgent. For the first time, they weren't leading, they were reacting. I remained behind for a moment, standing alone in the room where I'd once been dismissed without a thought. The city beyond the glass looked different now, not smaller, clearer. As I gathered my things, one of the board members approached me. Your grandfather was a wise man, he said. He'd be proud. I swallowed, emotion tightening my throat. He taught me to wait. That evening, as I stepped back into the cold air, snow brushing my coat, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. We need to talk. Privately. I slipped the phone into my pocket without replying. For years, they had controlled the conversation by deciding when it happened and on whose terms. That time was over, and as I walked away from the building, the weight I'd carried for so long finally began to lift, replaced by something quieter, steadier, and far more dangerous to those who had underestimated me. Control. The phone rang just after midnight, slicing through the quiet of my apartment like a blade. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Some instincts are trained by years of repetition. I let it ring, again and again. By the fourth call, the voicemail notification appeared. I didn't open it. I already knew the tone, urgent, accusatory, laced with the assumption that I would eventually cave, because I always had before. I set the phone face down on the table and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater and the distant city sounds below. The apartment was small, temporary, barely furnished, but it was quiet. No one was yelling, no one was demanding explanations or apologies. That alone felt like wealth. Earlier that evening, Daniel had walked me through the preliminary fallout from the board meeting. The postponed financing had triggered alarms across the company's network. Analysts were asking questions. Banks were nervous. The illusion of effortless control my father had cultivated for decades was cracking, and now my parents were panicking. The next morning, the voicemail count had climbed to 9. There were also 3 text messages, each more carefully worded than the last. "This doesn't have to get ugly. You're being manipulated. We're still your family." I deleted them without responding. At noon, Daniel arrived with a thin folder and an expression I'd learned to read. Calm on the surface, concern underneath. "They've contacted the bank," he said as we sat across from each other at my kitchen table. "They're trying to challenge the validity of the share transfer." I didn't react outwardly, but something cold settled in my chest. "On what grounds?" "Competency, influence, coercion." He paused. "They're suggesting your grandfather wasn't fully aware of what he was doing." I let out a slow breath. "Of course they are." Daniel met my eyes. "We anticipated this. Your grandfather anticipated this." He slid a document toward me. I recognized the handwriting immediately, the careful slant of each letter, the familiar steadiness. "He documented everything," Daniel continued. "Medical evaluations, independent witnesses, legal reviews. There's a reason these shares were structured the way they were." I ran my fingers over the paper, grounding myself in the reality of it. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No," Daniel said honestly, "but neither are we." The first formal letter arrived that afternoon. Thick paper, expensive letterhead. A law firm I recognized from my father's contacts. I read it once, then again, absorbing every line. It accused me of acting against the best interests of the family. It implied emotional instability. It warned of consequences if I didn't voluntarily relinquish control. I laughed out loud, the sound sharp and humorless in the empty room. They still thought this was about permission. I forwarded the letter to Daniel, then to the attorney he'd recommended, Vivian Rhodes. Her response came within minutes. "Do not engage directly. This is intimidation. We respond through proper channels." The word intimidation lingered with me longer than I expected. For years, I hadn't known what to call the constant pressure, the shifting expectations, the punishment disguised as concern. Now I had a name for it. That evening I went for a walk. Not because I needed air, but because I needed to feel my own body moving through the world without being watched. The streets were slick with melting snow, streetlights reflecting off the pavement in fractured gold. As I walked, memories surfaced uninvited. My mother correcting the way I spoke at dinner. My father reminding me how much everything cost. The unspoken rule that gratitude was required, but autonomy was forbidden. I stopped at a small park and sat on a cold bench, pulling my coat tighter. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the grief beneath the anger. I hadn't just lost my family recently. I'd lost them years ago, piece by piece, every time love was made conditional. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" There was a pause. Then my mother's voice, softer than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk," she said. I closed my eyes. "You've been talking for years." "This is different," she insisted. "Your father is under a lot of pressure." I pictured him pacing his office, barking orders that no longer landed with the same authority. "So am I." She inhaled sharply. "You don't understand what's at stake." I opened my eyes and looked at the dark trees ahead of me. "I understand exactly what's at stake. You just don't like that it's no longer you." There was silence on the line. Then, "We did what we thought was best." I felt something in me settle, solid and immovable. "No, you did what was best for you." Her voice cracked. "You're hurting your father." I almost laughed again. "You taught me that feelings are a weakness, remember?" Another pause. Longer this time. "You're making a mistake," she said finally. "I made one for years," I replied. "It won't be this one." I ended the call before she could respond. By the time I returned home, my hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the release of something I'd held inside for far too long. The next day brought escalation. Daniel called early. "They've filed an emergency motion." I sat up straighter. "For what?" "To freeze your voting rights pending investigation." I closed my eyes briefly. "And?" "And it's weak," he said, "but it's aggressive. They're trying to overwhelm you." I thought of the envelope my grandfather had left me, the words he'd written in that steady hand, only open when truly needed. He hadn't just given me assets. He'd given me armor. Vivian joined the call shortly after, her voice calm and precise. "They're attempting to paint you as emotionally compromised due to the recent family conflict." I let out a slow breath. "That conflict was orchestrated." "Yes," she said, "and we can prove it." Over the next hours, we assembled timelines, emails, witness statements, financial records. Patterns of behavior that, when laid out, told a story far different from the one my parents were trying to sell. By late afternoon, my living room looked like a command center. Papers spread across the table, laptops open, strategy unfolding in real time. At one point, Vivian looked directly at me. "This will get personal," I nodded. "It already is. They may attempt to provoke you, publicly or privately." "I won't give them that," I said, surprising even myself with the certainty in my voice. She smiled slightly. "Good. Silence is often more powerful than defense." That night, the news broke. An article appeared online, vague but pointed. Questions about internal governance, rumors of shareholder disputes, speculation about leadership stability. My father's name wasn't mentioned directly, but the implication was clear. My phone buzzed nonstop. Unknown numbers, emails, messages from distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly concerned. I ignored them all. Instead, I opened the envelope again. Not because I needed proof, but because I needed grounding. My grandfather's words reminded me that this was never about revenge. It was about choice, about refusing to be controlled by people who mistook dominance for love. Near midnight, Daniel sent a final update. "The banks are holding," he wrote, "for now." I replied with a simple acknowledgement, then turned off my phone. I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below, each one representing a life untouched by my family's chaos. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. And somewhere across the city, I knew my parents were realizing something terrifying. The daughter they had dismissed as a burden was no longer asking to be included. She was standing in the way. The courthouse smelled like old paper and recycled air, a place where arguments went to be stripped of emotion and measured in facts. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I needed the quiet before the room filled with voices that had once controlled my life. Vivian was already there, seated with her laptop open, reading glasses perched low on her nose. She looked up when I approached and gave me a small nod, the kind that said everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "They filed aggressively," she said without preamble, "but sloppily." I took the seat beside her, smoothing my coat over my knees. "They always confuse force with strategy." She smiled faintly. "That assumption is going to cost them." Across the aisle, my parents sat with their attorney. My mother's posture was rigid, hands folded tightly in her lap. My father leaned forward, whispering sharply, his jaw clenched. When his eyes flicked toward me, there was no warmth there, only calculation. I met his gaze calmly, then looked away. The judge entered, and the room rose in unison. As we sat again, the atmosphere shifted from tense to surgical. This wasn't about who spoke louder, it was about who came prepared. The opposing attorney stood first, launching into a well-rehearsed narrative about concern and protection and family responsibility. Words like instability and undue influence floated through the room, carefully chosen to sound compassionate while cutting deep. Vivian waited. When it was her turn, she stood slowly, her voice steady and unhurried. "Your Honor," she began, "this petition is not about safeguarding assets. It is about control." She laid out the timeline piece by piece. The share transfer, the documented medical evaluations, the independent legal oversight my grandfather had insisted on. Each fact landed with quiet precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The judge listened, occasionally glancing at the documents projected onto the screen. My parents shifted uncomfortably. Their attorney attempted an interruption, but the judge waved her off. "Counsel," he said curtly, "let her finish." Vivian concluded with a sentence that seemed to echo. "This court is being asked to intervene not because my client is unfit, but because she is no longer compliant." Silence followed. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "I see no grounds for an emergency freeze," he said finally. "The documentation supports the validity of the transfer." My mother inhaled sharply. My father stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The motion was denied. As we stood to leave, my father turned to me, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't over." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt nothing but distance. "It is for me." Outside, the winter air hit my face, sharp and bracing. Vivian walked beside me, her heels clicking confidently against the pavement. "You handled that well," she said. "No reaction, no bait." "I learned from the best," I replied quietly. She stopped and turned to me. "This is the point where they escalate emotionally, guilt, fear, public pressure." I nodded. "Let them." The escalation came sooner than expected. By evening, a story had circulated among extended family. Concerned messages arrived from aunts and cousins I hadn't seen in years, all echoing the same theme. "We're worried about you. Your parents are beside themselves. This isn't like you." I read each message once, then archived them. That night, Daniel called. "They've reached out to several minority shareholders," he said, "trying to build a coalition." "To do what?" I asked. "Force a vote. Create the appearance of internal unrest." I leaned back against the counter, considering. Who's listening? "Some," he admitted, "but most are waiting to see how you respond." I smiled slightly. "Then let's keep them waiting." The next morning I attended my first shareholder luncheon. The room buzzed with low conversation as I entered. Conversations paused briefly, eyes tracking me before resuming at a lower volume. I recognized several faces from annual reports and company profiles, people who had always existed on the periphery of my father's world. A woman in a navy blazer approached first, extending her hand. "I wanted to meet you," she said warmly. "Your grandfather spoke highly of you." Something loosened in my chest. "Thank you. He meant a great deal to me." As the hour unfolded, more followed. Questions asked carefully, observations shared quietly. I listened more than I spoke, learning where loyalties lay and where doubts lingered. Not once did I mention my parents. That absence spoke louder than any accusation. Later that afternoon, my mother appeared unannounced at my building. The doorman called to inform me, his tone cautious. "She insists it's urgent," he said. I closed my eyes briefly. "Tell her I'm unavailable." "She says she won't leave." I exhaled slowly. "Then tell her she's trespassing." There was a pause. Then, "Understood." She left 10 minutes later. That evening I opened the envelope again. The paper was creased now, familiar. I traced the words my grandfather had written, letting them anchor me. Do not confuse obligation with love. I realized then that this chapter of my life wasn't about defeating my parents. It was about unlearning the instinct to justify myself to them. The following days passed in a blur of meetings and quiet victories. The banks held firm. The board remained cautious but respectful. My parents' influence waned with each unanswered call. One afternoon, Daniel sent me a message that made me pause. "They're preparing to sell personal assets." I frowned. "Why?" "To cover shortfalls," he replied, "and legal fees." The image of my parents scrambling behind closed doors should have satisfied me. Instead, it left me hollow. That night, I went back to the park where I'd sat days earlier. The bench was cold, the trees bare, but the air felt different now. Lighter. I thought about the girl who had stood barefoot on a porch, holding a trash bag, believing she had nothing. I wished I could tell her what I knew now. That silence could be strength. That power didn't always announce itself. That survival was only the beginning. When my phone buzzed, I expected another unknown number. Instead, it was Daniel. "They've requested mediation," he said. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. "On what terms?" "Yours," he answered. I smiled to myself, a slow, quiet smile. For the first time, the fight wasn't about being heard. It was about choosing whether I wanted to speak at all. And as I stood to leave the park, snow beginning to fall softly around me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing. The mediation room was smaller than I expected, deliberately neutral, with beige walls and a long oval table that forced everyone to face each other. No podiums, no elevated seats, just people and the truths they could no longer avoid. I arrived first, not because I wanted the advantage, but because I wanted to settle my nerves before seeing them again. The silence pressed in around me as I took a seat near the window. Outside, traffic crawled through slushy streets, ordinary life continuing while my family prepared to confront what they had spent decades denying. Vivian sat beside me, composed as ever, reviewing notes on her tablet. She glanced up. "Remember," she said quietly, "this is not about reconciliation. This is about boundaries." I nodded. "I know." "Do you?" a small voice inside me asked. "Or do you still hope they'll say something that makes it hurt less?" The door opened, and my parents walked in with their attorney. My mother's eyes darted to me immediately, searching my face for something familiar. My father avoided looking at me altogether, his jaw set tight. We stood briefly, then sat. The mediator, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a practiced calm, cleared his throat. He explained the rules, the purpose, the goal of finding a mutually acceptable resolution. His words sounded distant, like they were meant for another room, another family. When he finished, he gestured to my parents. "You requested this mediation. You may begin." My mother clasped her hands together, fingers twisting. "We're here because we're worried," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "About you, about the choices you're making." I stared at the table, at the faint scratch near the edge, grounding myself. My father leaned forward. "This situation has gotten out of hand," he said. "Public disputes, legal threats. It's not good for anyone." "For the company," I said quietly. He flinched, then recovered. "For the family." I looked up then. "You threw me out." My mother inhaled sharply. That was an argument. Emotions were high. "You locked the door behind me," I said evenly. "In winter." Silence fell. The mediator shifted uncomfortably. Vivian's hand brushed mine briefly, a reminder that I wasn't alone. My father cleared his throat. "We made a mistake," he said stiffly, "but that doesn't justify what you're doing now." "What am I doing?" I asked. "Using your grandfather's assets against us," he snapped. There it was. The truth, stripped of pretense. I let the words hang in the air. "They aren't your assets." "They were meant to support the family," my mother said quickly. They were meant to support me, I replied. That's what he decided. Her eyes glistened. You're tearing us apart. I felt a familiar pull in my chest, the instinct to apologize, to soften, to make things easier for them even at my own expense. I recognized it now for what it was. Conditioning. I didn't tear anything apart, I said slowly. I stepped out of the place you trapped me in. My father scoffed. You always exaggerate. Vivian leaned forward then, her voice calm but firm. With respect, this mediation is not the place to rewrite history. The documented facts are clear. The mediator raised a hand gently. Let's refocus. What outcome are you seeking today? My parents exchanged a glance. We want her to relinquish voting control, my father said, at least temporarily, until emotions settle. I laughed softly, unable to stop myself. The sound surprised even me. No, I said. My mother's face crumpled. Please, she whispered. Your father's position is at risk. I tilted my head. You told me I was a burden, a liability, someone who contributed nothing. That's not what we meant, she said quickly. It's what you said, I replied. Repeatedly. My father slammed his hand lightly on the table. You're being vindictive. I met his gaze steadily. I'm being honest. The mediator looked between us. Is there any compromise you're willing to consider? I took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the turning point, the place where the story could fork. Yes, I said finally. My parents leaned forward in unison. I'm willing to consider options that protect the company, I continued, not ones that restore your control over me. My father's eyes narrowed. Such as? Professional governance, I said. Independent oversight, transparent decision-making. That undermines leadership, he snapped. It replaces unchecked authority, Vivian corrected. My mother shook her head. This is about punishing us. No, I said softly. This is about never letting you punish me again. The words felt like a release, like something heavy finally being set down. The mediator scribbled notes. Perhaps we should take a short break. During the pause, I stood by the window, watching snow begin to fall again. Vivian joined me. You did well, she said quietly. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something, I admitted. Like if I step wrong, I'll fall back into old habits. She studied me thoughtfully. You're not stepping back. You're stepping through. When we reconvened, my parents looked different. Less certain, less composed. My father spoke again, his voice lower. If you don't help us, the company could suffer. I turned to him. You taught me that consequences are how people learn. My mother reached for my hand across the table. I pulled back instinctively. Don't, I said gently but firmly. She recoiled as if struck. The mediator cleared his throat. It seems there is limited common ground. That's because we don't share the same definition of family, I said. The session ended without an agreement. As we stood to leave, my father stopped me near the door. You think you've won, he said quietly, but power isolates. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man terrified of losing relevance. Control isolates, I replied. Connection doesn't. I walked out without waiting for his response. Outside, the air felt sharp and clean. Vivian exhaled beside me. They showed their hand. They always do, I said. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I replayed the day in my mind. The accusations, the pleas, the familiar tug of guilt. It didn't grip me the way it used to. Instead, I felt clarity. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to the board, not defensive, not emotional, just factual. Outlining my position, my expectations, my willingness to act in the company's best interest. When I hit send, I felt something settle into place. The next morning, a message arrived from Daniel. They're panicking, he wrote, and the board is listening to you. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that. That afternoon, my mother sent one final message. We never meant to hurt you. I stared at it for a long time before responding. Intent doesn't erase impact. I set the phone down and walked to the window, watching the city move below me. Somewhere in those streets were people living lives untouched by the dynamics that had defined mine. I thought of my grandfather again, of the quiet way he had prepared me for this moment without ever saying it out loud. This wasn't revenge. It was release. And as the snow fell steadily outside, I understood something profound. Walking away didn't mean I lost my family. It meant I stopped losing myself. The boardroom was colder than I remembered, not in temperature but in tone, the kind of chill that settled into your bones when power shifted and no one wanted to admit it. I arrived early again, not out of habit this time, but intention. I wanted to sit at the table before anyone else and feel what it was like to take up space without apology. The long glass table reflected the ceiling lights like a sheet of ice. Name placards were neatly arranged, most of them familiar from years of overheard conversations and whispered reverence in my parents' house. These were the people I'd been taught to fear. The people whose approval my father chased like oxygen. The people who had never learned my name until now. Daniel entered quietly and took the seat beside me. He placed a slim folder in front of me,